What Kabul means in Delhi. The Taliban have seized Kabul, what explains the capitulation of the US and Afghan forces, and what should India do in this crisis given its past reluctance to talk with the Taliban. With the Taliban entering the outlying districts of Kabul on Sunday and issuing a formal declaration that they do not intend to conduct a witch hunt against those with the Islamic Republic government, while it waited for the completion of a transition process and amid parallel reports of efforts to form a transitional or interim government for 6 months, the wheel has come full circle on the post 9/11 US war on terror in Afghanistan since 2001 and the country's experiment with an Islamic Republic in 2004. India should be a first responder in the current crisis for humanitarian and longer term political reasons. Why the capitulation? The first reports from Kabul describes the tension and doomsday fears, but no serious outbreaks of violence in the city. The immediate challenge is a massive humanitarian crisis on account of the hundreds of thousands of internally displaced who have left the war zone and taken shelter on pavements and parks in Kabul. The second is the panic and rush for passports and visas for those who fear for their lives from the Taliban on their sponsors. India should facilitate emergency visas and evacuation of those close to India who will be under threat. Outbreaks of violence and political persecution should be anticipated. The biggest losers in the transition will be Afghan women and youth who had tasted political, civic, economic, and human rights and opportunities and media freedoms. Three questions loom uppermost in the minds of observers in India. First, what accounts for the near total capitulation of the 3 lakh to 3 lakh 50,000 US and NATO trained and equipped Afghan army and police forces, and the ANDSF without much of a fight, barring a few honorable exceptions in Laksagar, Herat, and Talokan, against light armed insurgents estimates to be around 60,000. Second, what can explain the US decision to pull out its troops unconditionally without waiting for a negotiated political settlement, regardless of consequences that were almost entirely predictable, other than the speed with which it occurred? And third, what can explain India's reluctance to engage the Taliban and what can it do? It is too early for any firm or complete answer to the first question. There is a little doubt that the undermining of the September 2019 elections by the Zalame Khalilzad led US peace process while trying to force a transitional government as part of the US Taliban deal, the contested elections and dysfunctional government that came out of it, and an increasingly discredited Ghani government were part of the problem, as was mismanagement of appointments in key security ministries, especially the Ministry of Defense. Equally true is the fact that despite clear intimations and notices of withdrawal of US support to President Ashraf Ghani and the US troops, regardless of what Afghans felt, the Afghan army was unprepared and caught by surprise by the Taliban offensive. Technical dependence on the US for air support, weapon system, and intelligence, physiological denial that they would indeed leave as they want, a lack of military strategy, poor supplies and logistics, indefensible and thinly manned posts, unpaid salaries, phantom roles, and the sense of betrayal, abandonment, and demoralization all played a role in this. Responsibility with the US. More importantly, there were also structural reasons for their failure, for which, notwithstanding the sacrifices made by the West in Afghanistan, responsibility must lie with the US and NATO to fit the US definition of the war on terror, and also for reasons of cost of developing such an army to NATO standards. The Afghan National Army was never really trained and equipped with normal attributes of a national army capable of defending territory with adequate mobility, artillery, armor, engineering, logistics, intelligence, air support, etc. for rugged terrain, and infantry battalions and doctrine designed for it. On the contrary, most of the efforts went into grooming special forces units meant to recover targets of urban terrorist attacks, at which they acquitted themselves admirably, but not offensive operations. In sum, they invested just enough for the war on terror but not the defense of Afghanistan, although it was perfectly aware of the connection between the two in the Pakistani role in nurturing the Taliban. Pakistan also leveraged US dependence on ground lines of communication through Pakistan to ensure the ANA remained stunted. Afghan authorities, aware of this, approached other countries for such equipment, but nothing that was not interoperable and up to NATO standards would have been acceptable. Pakistani masterminds exploited this weakness since the Taliban regrouped in Pakistan and used it once the US was clearly on the way out. As a result, it was left to the limited number of Afghan Special Forces commando units to fight what was effectively a Pakistani invasion with an Afghan face and foreign fighters, most of all from Pakistan, from one theater to another without adequate support. US motives for literally abandoning a 20-year investment in blood, treasure, and associates are more puzzling. First, it is arguable that after the end of the Soviet intervention and the fall of the Soviet Union, the US has never really considered Afghanistan of strategic importance. For all its 1 trillion investment in Afghanistan and is aware of Afghanistan mineral wealth, the US never really invested in the Afghan economy or attempt to integrate to its economic sphere of influence as it did in the intervention after World War II in Europe, East Asia, and later in the oil economies of the Gulf. Neither did it invest in Afghan democracy as an antidote to the kind of Taliban religious fundamentalism that is intrinsically linked to religious extremism and terrorism. Ironically, despite Western attempts to portray the Afghan democracy that came in the wake of failure 20 years since the ouster of the Taliban, for all its flaws, have arguably been one of the most promising periods in Afghanistan's recent history in terms of education and capacity building, in which India too played a major part. If one were to take just one metric, refugee, this was the one period when there was a net return of refugees and expatriates, not outflow of refugees that has now begun. More baffling is why the US should cede strategic space in Afghanistan in the most vulnerable underbelly of its principal strategic rival Xinjiang for China, while it is working to contain in the Indo-Pacific and elsewhere the Central Asian republics for Russia and Iran to the west. One of the ironies of the US intervention in Afghanistan is that far from using Afghanistan strategically against its rival in the region, it ended up effectively extending security against the Taliban for them. Is it then possible that the primary motivation behind the decision to withdraw from Afghanistan is not fatigue from an endless war, but a cold-blooded decision to convert what was essentially a counter-terrorist operation against Al-Qaeda that expanded a limited counter-insurgency operation, learning from the Iraq experience until President Barack Obama's surge into a drawdown and training mission from Obama to Trump into finally as intelligence operation using the Taliban, whose return it has legitimized and facilitated through the US-Taliban deal and its withdrawal to destabilize the region to keep China, Russia, Iran and possibly even Pakistan off balance with Afghanistan, the Central Asian republics and India as collateral damage. What next for India? Finally, what should India do under the circumstances? With the Taliban in Kabul, the old debate in India on whether to talk or not to the Taliban is now academic. Taliban have proclaimed that there will be no witch hunt, that will be respect to transitional process and it will work for future Islamic system that is acceptable to all. Prudence dictates that we keep an open mind, wait and watch what they actually do during and after the transitional process, access how inclusive they are in accommodating the gains of the last 20 years and the progressive principles of Islamic Republic, judge the opposition to Taliban rule and our security needs before we jump into any hasty recognition of any Islamic emirate, which will have profound consequences for the region, the world and the US in particular. Thank you.